Hello, I'm Abby Rubin, and I'm on the NEXTGen Detroit Executive Board. I work with the Social Action Committee. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this important conversation with Judy Heumann, disability rights activist and star in the award-winning Crip Camp film, which was just playing. The full film is available to stream on Netflix. This clip showed Judy in the 1970s organizing and advocating for a national policy that would make buildings more accessible. I want to acknowledge that we as a Jewish community have been slow to draw attention to those with disabilities in our community. And we as NEXTGen Detroit are working to make our programming more accessible to folks with disabilities. We are new to this and we might stumble and use the wrong language at times. However, we want to model that it's important to be inclusive in everything we do, even as we all are still learning.
Thank you, Abby. Hi, guys. I'm Andrew Luckoff, another NEXTGen Detroit board member. I now have the pleasure of introducing Judy Heumann. As a young child, Judy contracted polio, which causes her to use a wheelchair for mobility. Judy has had a long career as a leader in the disability community. Amongst her many accomplishments, Judy led a 28-day-long sit-in in the 70s to fight for the enactment of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which was the first U.S. federal civil rights protection for people with disabilities. Judy co-founded the World Institute on Disability and served under the Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary of the Office of Special Education Rehabilitation for the U.S. Department of Education. Judy also served in the Obama administration as the first special advisor for international disability rights in the U.S. Department of State from 2010 to 2017. Judy is the author of Being Human, an unrepresented memoir of a disability rights activist, and is featured in the Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, an award-winning documentary film now on Netflix, which you just saw a portion of.
Absolutely, and hi everybody, my name is Jacob Smith, and I'm going to be kicking off the moment that you've all been waiting for, the discussion with Judy. And so just want to remind everybody that as we go, please don't hesitate to drop questions in the chat window here, and we will do our very best to work them in the best that we can. So I want to just say that as I was preparing to interview Judy, who is just an absolute superstar, I was feeling really good about everything until I noticed that she had recently been interviewed by Trevor Noah about her new book and just immediately got really nervous. So just so you know, Judy, I'm an enormous fan of yours. Very, very excited to be chatting with you here today. Welcome, and thank you so much for talking with NEXTGen Detroit. And you're muted, just so you know.
I said, great to be with you all, and I'm sorry I'm not literally with you all, but very nice to be here.
Well, in some ways it makes things easier, so thank you so much. And so just to kind of kick things off, you know, a majority of the folks turning in, NEXTGen Detroit caters to folks that are 25 to 40. So that means that we all grew up in a time where ramps and automatic doors and elevators and such were commonplace. So I was hoping that you could just contextualize the conversation and let us know, what was it like growing up in Brooklyn, New York in the 40s and 50s?
So really, I think 50s and 60s, because I was born in 40s. Oh, why did that happen? It doesn't show that I'm muted here. Anyway, no, it popped up with a sign that said it was muted. Anyway, so I, as you were saying, grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My parents were German Jewish refugees. They came over when they were 12 and 14, and we lost a good number of our family members in the Holocaust. Growing up in Brooklyn also at that time was right after the Second World War. So obviously as a child, I had no understanding of what any of that meant, but you know, when you look back at it historically, it basically was the US had been through a depression, then through a major war, and then, you know, was basically rebuilding. Not like in Europe where there was a lot of physical destruction, but rebuilding the economy. My father and his brother had a small butcher store. Everybody on my father's side who came over, you know, in the 30s and 40s. Everybody was in the meat business. They owned, you know, butcher stores, and it was a time when, you know, there were great bakeries and all kinds of things going on for many communities. And I mentioned, you know, the food in Brooklyn because I think, you know, as Jewish people, food is also something that's very important. So when I think about things, I think about my family and our relatives and food, and that was all very an important part of what was happening. So on the one hand, you know, my life was kind of like other people's lives. I was at 18 months old, though that changed when I had polio. And, you know, so there were epidemics until the vaccine came out in 1955, and I had polio during one of those epidemics. Now, there were no laws in place in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s to protect the rights of disabled people. So when my mom took me to school to register me, the principal said I couldn't go to the school. Didn't offer an alternative school to go to, and said that the Board of Ed would send a teacher to my house. And they did, not in kindergarten, in the first, second, third, and half of the fourth grade, for a total of 2.5 hours a week. So, you know, you can kind of begin to see that the expectations of my parents, which were, you know, that I'd get an education. And I think, you know, one thing that was different was, you know, my mom would say, you may not get married, so you really need to go to school. You're going to have to support yourself, which really at that time was pretty progressive because women at that time, young women, were expected really to get married, have kids, and maybe work for a while and then to leave the workforce. So that really wasn't my expectation. It was kind of the opposite. And then, you know, while I was integrated in my neighborhood and with our family, went to Hebrew school and things like that, in school and in the community, the environment itself, you know, New York City obviously is a very big city, lots of buses and trains and all types of things like that. And none of them were accessible. So when I was younger, you know, my parents would drive us around. But as we were getting older, that's not what like my peers were doing or my brothers were doing. So I think I went from being in a community where I felt integrated, not in school, but after school, in brownies and, you know, all types of things. But then that started to change. And for those of you who've seen Crip Camp, you know, one of the important parts of Crip Camp and other camps for disabled kids was the ability to be with other disabled people and really begin to think about who we were and the importance of talking and being with other disabled people to kind of begin to think about our futures.
Yeah, and so just to kind of continue contextualizing, so for folks that maybe haven't seen the documentary and aren't particularly familiar with the disability rights movement, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen throughout your lifetime?
Well, we went from having no laws to having the Rehabilitation Act amended, which included Section 504. Section 504 is a law that makes it illegal to discriminate if you are an entity receiving money from the federal government. You may not discriminate against an individual with a disability. So I'd like to broaden this discussion beyond the physical environment because, you know, that's just one part of it. But 504 and 501 and 503 and 508 and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and ultimately in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act and other laws that have come since then. We went from an environment where education discrimination, the ability to get into school, the ability to go to universities, lack of accessibility, discrimination in the fields that you might wish to study in. I mean, it was basically you know, people thought they could do whatever they wanted as far as discrimination was concerned. And I think, you know, one of the important parts of what we need to reflect on is that discrimination against disabled people was not really called discrimination. It was kind of invisible. It's like, oh, couldn't go to school. Oh, the buses aren't accessible. Oh, the trains aren't accessible. No one, I don't want to say no one, but obviously the disability community. And I think, you know, it's important to realize that after the Second World War, there were many veterans who in the First World War died because there was no penicillin.
Mm.
But with the development of penicillin, many spinal cord injured people, men, women, significantly men at that time, who were injured in the war, came back to the United States using wheelchairs. And they, you know, had been non-disabled people previously. They were quote unquote war heroes who came back to no jobs, discrimination, lack of accessibility. And so, you know, you'll see that there was a group called the Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association, which is part of the Paralyzed Veterans Association. And they were and continue to really fight for rights in the area of transportation and other areas, healthcare also. But they really helped move that. The disability community itself, as far as organizing, I would say start in a couple of ways. In addition to the veterans, the parent community began to organize, particularly parents who had children with cerebral palsy. The March of Dimes, which was the organization that worked with people who had polio, really was not engaged in helping to get kids into school or really looking at any of the broader issues about rights and equality. And during the civil rights movement, many of us were really beginning to see what other political movements were doing. And I think it was particularly important that we had television and we're able to see, you know, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, freedom riders, the people that were, you know, fighting to get schools integrated, Brown versus Board of Education, all these different things that were going on. And it really, for me and many other people, was the beginning of looking at the fact that things could be done differently. And I have to say, the Jewish community really at that time, I don't think was it was very involved in the civil rights movement. But the '64 Civil Rights Act did not have anything about disability. And in 1968, there was an attempt to amend the Civil Rights Act of '64 and to include disability in it. And there was legitimate opposition from the civil rights community because there was real concern that some of the more conservative members of the Congress would not just look at expanding the law to include disabled people, but rather they would have looked at amendments to weaken the law. So that legitimately didn't happen. So in the 70s, really what you were beginning to see was a couple of things. The law itself, which included Section 504, was the result of some staffers and members on the House and Senate side, a guy named Michael Burns, who was a disabled veteran himself, looking at the opportunity of including provisions like 504 in this particular law. And it went through without much discussion. And you know, in the US, when we pass a law, we typically develop something called regulations or rules, which explain to people what the law does and what the law doesn't do. And so when this law finally was signed by President Nixon in '73, it took a good number of years for the rules to be developed. So what the changes we were seeing was an organizing group of disabled people, particularly on university campuses. So there were more disabled students that were beginning to go to universities, veterans and others. And you'll see that there were disability services programs that were being set up, that were being demanded by disabled students on campus. And in Michigan, there were quite a number of them that were being set up then. And it was those groups that really started to work on campuses, across some of the campuses, plus the work that, you know, in Crip Camp, you'll see from the disabled people there. But, you know, there was a slow, gradual maturation. And I think very much a recognition that what we thought as something logical and something that needed to happen, that being the granting of equality and rights to disabled people. Because in 1975, when the education law was passed, according to government figures, there were at least 1 million disabled children not in school at all. That was 1975. And there were really more than that. And then many of those kids were in segregated schools or segregated classes, not being taught the same as others. And discrimination in employment was pretty rampant. And, you know, my experience with applying for a job as a teacher and failing the medical exam after passing the oral and written exam and being denied my job for that. And the American Civil Liberties Union telling me that it wasn't discrimination, that I was being denied a job based on a medical issue and not wanting to meet to talk about it. So I think, you know, you can begin to see that these different laws and the organizing of disabled people, and also, you know, in the US today, there are 61 million disabled people. At that point, the count was like 35 million. But like today and then, many disabled people really have not identified or have been afraid of identifying. But what was going on at that point, and still is today, is slowly a recognition from disabled individuals that it is important that we come out and that we are able to speak up for what we are experiencing and really fight to, in some cases, get laws implemented like 504, and in other cases, continue to work on the development of laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Wonderful. And you covered so many different areas there that I want to jump into. But you said something notable. You mentioned 61 million disabled people in the U.S. And I've heard you use language around like one of the largest marginalized communities in the country. I guess again, kind of continuing to just paint the context. When you talk about accessibility in this context, who all is encompassed when you say disabled? And as a follow-on question there, when you make a distinction between disabled and non-disabled, I was hoping you could speak to that as well.
The disabled and non-disabled, for me, you have a disability, you're disabled. You don't have a disability, you're non-disabled. And the question of who are disabled people is a very important question. So I think, you know, if you look at Section 504, remember that's the law that says if you're getting money from the federal, if you're an entity getting money from the federal government, you may not discriminate against someone based on disability. One of the reasons it took from 1973 to 1977 to get the regulation signed, let's remember that the Republicans vetoed the President Ford refused to sign the regulations in 1976. But before that, there were legitimate reasons for taking time to develop these rules, because we needed to look at what was the definition, who was a disabled person. And so you'll see there's a three-pronged definition. You're considered to have a disability if you have one or more mm, i- if you're impacted by one or, oh God, sorry, if one or more of your major life activities are affected. So for example, the ability to walk, the ability to see, the ability to hear, the ability to um, eat, having issues with processing, on and on. So we're looking at people with all kinds of physical disabilities. We're looking at people with invisible disabilities, like depression, anxiety, bipolar. We're looking at people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. A word that previously was used was mentally retarded. That word is not used anymore. It's really not considered an appropriate term. People with learning disabilities, people with ADD or ADHD, people with Parkinson's, people with cancer. And one very important thing to remember is that disability cuts across all communities, and that disability is also linked to poverty. And so you will see higher rates of disability in poorer communities, things like diabetes and hypertension and obesity and things like that, which are medical issues. So, and that's the first prong. One or more major life activities that you're having, that there are issues with. The other would be that you are perceived of as having a disability. And that could be your mother had COVID and you were home when your mother had COVID. And so you're perceived of, because some people who have had COVID now will have disabilities, but many people who've had COVID potentially could be discriminated against because they had it. And if an individual believed that they were being discriminated against because they had COVID, then they would have a legitimate right to file a complaint under Section 504 or the Americans with Disabilities Act. So one or more major life activities are impacted. You have a history of a disability, or you have had, as I was saying, you have been associated with someone who had AIDS, and therefore you are being denied a job or admission to what school or whatever it may be, because there was a perception that you had a disability as a result of being with someone else. So all of those things now are illegal, and under the ADA and 504, you can file complaints. Now, one thing I want to say about these laws is they are by and large predicated on people declaring that they believe they've been discriminated against, and then a government agency or the courts looking at and determining whether or not it is agreed that there was discrimination. Another very important part of these laws is something called reasonable accommodation. So if you're going to a university and you have a disability and you need like extended time to take a test for whatever you can verify your disability is. If you're being denied that and you've been able to show that you have a disability, that's something that you could file a complaint about. You can go to your university or file a complaint in various places. So there's a lot of latitude. One other thing I want to say is it's very important to recognize that most people who have disabilities acquire those disabilities after they're children, after they're teenagers. People are acquiring their disabilities. You know, you'll see there's spinal cord injuries as an example. There's a real spike in the 15 to 25-year-old group because people are more risky in things they're doing, drinking and driving, diving in places where the water isn't deep, and other activities which cause spinal cord injuries. But then as you're getting older, sight and vision are other areas that in many cases will diminish. So there's a very, very broad range of what a disability is.
I think something that I heard you mention in another interview that really struck me is just that, given what you just said, there's a very high likelihood, unfortunately, or excuse me, not unfortunately, there's a very high likelihood that any given person that's tuning in right now will have a disability at some point in their life. So I think when we're thinking about policy related to disability, it's not only the right thing to do, it's also something that directly impacts most people, either individually or loved ones in their life. I think that's
Or
something
their
that
friends or family. Or,
friends.
but I want to go back to the word unfortunately.
Yeah, please.
And I know you pulled it back because you know it's not the right word to say.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think it's very important that, you know, if you go and watch the Trevor Noah piece, and you can go to YouTube, Trevor Noah, March 4th, you know, in the back and forth discussion, he used the word able-bodied.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like the word able-bodied because to me, it connotes something which says someone who's quote unquote able is better than me as a disabled person.
Mm-hmm.
So when he said that, and of course, everything was completely unrehearsed. When he said able-bodied, I'm like, am I going to let this go?
Hmm.
Or am I going to say something? And I thought, I'm going to say something. What the hell? So I said, oh, I don't like that word. You're non-disabled. And I have to remember the exact words. So I said, you know, I have a disability, you're non-disabled, and at some point it is likely that you will move from being temporarily able-bodied. And he said, are you threatening me? And I just like the word that you used, although we didn't get into having a discussion really about it. I said, I'm not threatening you, it's a reality of what's gonna happen. But one of the important parts of the discussion here and other places really needs to be is, why is it that when you hear people talk about diversity and include every group, right? Black, Latino, Indigenous, straight, gay, Muslims, Jews, blah, blah, blah. The word disability in that litany hardly ever is raised. And with 61 million people, we are the largest minority in the United States. And there are more than 1 billion disabled people in the world. And I think, you know, one area that we're seeing increasing numbers of disabled people are issues around the environment. So pollution, air pollution, other forms of pollution that are causing things like asthma and lung cancers. Those are all disabilities. And so I think it is important for people to recognize in this discussion of disabled and non-disabled that we all need to be in this together. Because on the one hand, you know, working collaboratively means that those of us who currently have disabilities will be able to have opportunities like we would like everyone to have, whether we're Black or brown or Indigenous or have a physical or mental or whatever the disability may be. And that is not going to happen easily. And I think, you know, talking as Jews, you know, we really, okay, I'll give you an example. In the 1980s, when I was living in Berkeley, I live in Washington, D.C. now, grew up in Brooklyn, the Jewish Weekly had, you know, a dating service. And I really wanted to try to marry someone who was Jewish. And I was interested in the form because there were two questions in that form. One was, do you have a disability? And the other one was, would you consider dating someone with a disability? So I answered both of those questions affirmatively. I had a disability and I would consider dating someone with a disability. And you were supposed to get your you sent them $35 or $36, and you were supposed to hear something like in a month. That summer was the first summer that I ever went to Israel. So I went to Israel, and I was there for like 6 weeks. And so I filled out the form in June. And in September, my friend helped me get the mail from our mailbox. And there was an envelope from the Jewish Weekly. And I opened it up, and a check fell out. And the letter said that they were very sorry, but there was no one who met my qualifications. Now, if disability was not an issue, I guarantee you that I'm not all that different than other people my age group. You know, I'm not brilliant. I'm not looking for someone with a 300 IQ or a millionaire or anything like that. So it's just kind of a, you know, working class filling out application. And that, you know, very much, I think, then maybe not as much today, but still, you know, we look at disability as adversity. And I think really what we need to be doing is looking at what is causing adversity. So what is causing adversity for Black people, for brown people, for indigenous people, for poor people, you know, for people from the LGBTQ community? What is causing that adversity? And really, like in the area of disability, it is how we treat people. It's how we create and implement our policies and laws that really positively or negatively impact people's lives. And in the case of disabled people, you know, it goes a little bit beyond because of some of the things that we need that others may not need, like a sign language interpreter or a personal assistant, or I don't even want to say accessibility, because accessibility is something that really should be on a regular basis being built into the environment, and it still isn't. I mean, it is way more than it was when I was first growing up. But, you know, it's still, you know, we don't have laws at the state or local level in most places that, for example, require that when a private home is being built, that it is accessible. You know, so when the fires in Oakland, California in 1989 or 90, whatever year it was, burned down hundreds of homes in the hills, which is a wealthy area. And people rebuilt all these homes with all these steps. You know, it's like, it was like mind blowing to me, because, you know, people bought their homes and it might have been 5 or 10 years after they bought their homes. So they're older now, and people don't want to live in nursing homes. But one of the big reasons, you know, when you look at COVID and you look at the percentage of people who have died, like 40 to 50% of those people are disabled individuals who are dying in nursing homes. They don't call people there disabled, but they wouldn't be there if they didn't have some kind of a disability. They'd be in their home, right? Or with their family or someplace. I have this bug, sorry. So I think, you know, it's really important that we look at what are the fear factors. You know, what is it that makes people so afraid of acquiring a disability? And it can, in many ways, alter your life. There's no doubt about it. But my life is much more hampered by the views of other people towards me, by the lack of accessibility, by, you know, the check falling out of the envelope, and people, you know, not really thinking much about it.
Gotcha. And then I do just want to quickly mention that when you read Judy's new book, Being Human, about halfway through the book, she notes where her self-perception started to change and realized that she was actually quite attractive, I believe, were her words, and started to date actively. So
dated in
juicy
camp.
gossip there, just to let everybody know. But yeah, so one more thing to mention, and then I really want to pivot and really talk about your activism in a broader sense, you know, as you know, really human rights activism. But another point that you made that was so salient for this group particularly is that many of the accommodations that exist or that were implemented to assist folks who have disabilities also help young parents with strollers, for example, and other folks as well. So I think that that's something really interesting for everyone to consider, that ramps and elevators and you know, the buttons that open doors and all those things help many other, you know, it helps everybody or a vast majority of people.
Technology, I think, is another very important area, you know, for people who are losing hearing, or when people are not speaking clearly or have different accents. Things like captioning are very important. And now, you know, when most, like, I'm a member of a synagogue here in DC, and most synagogues now are virtual, but still, you know, getting sign language interpreters or captioning on a regular basis is not happening in most synagogues. And so, you know, there are whole groups of people. I remember in the 90s, I met a disabled guy who had an intellectual disability, and he came up to me and he said, you know, I was born Jewish. And I said, oh, great. And he said, but he then was in an institution that was run by nuns, and he was now Catholic.
Wow.
And so, I mean, he can choose whatever religion he wants or doesn't want. But the real implication for that was, I mean, he didn't have to come tell me he was Jewish. So there was something that he was identifying with. And I think, you know, as a Jewish community, you know, the Ruderman Foundation in Boston is really doing some very good work on really getting the Jewish community more engaged in looking what we need to be doing to make our Jewish life more inclusive and to look at many of these issues.
Yeah, and I do want to mention that inspired by this program and other conversations that we've been having within NextGen, we definitely see some clear opportunities to improve the accessibility of our programming as well. Notably,
but I would really move beyond accessibility.
Okay.
I think it's very important. But I think what we're talking about is people really being able to feel comfortable and equal within a group.
Yeah.
And I think for people who have invisible disabilities, and when you consider that 20 to 25% of the US population has a disability, with many of them having invisible disabilities, it is very likely that people in your group and or family members or both have disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Depression, anxiety right now with COVID are things that are pretty stark and can be very isolating, and people can be afraid of talking about many of these things, or people have learning disabilities or other things like that. I think it's really important, you know, that there are ways that people can feel comfortable talking about the totality of who we are. And I think if we can't bring our whole self to the table, it's a problem. And, you know, I understand, really, you know, you're like, I guess, 18 to 30. And, you know, there are many things going on in your lives, but if disability is one of those issues in your life and you feel like you can't speak about it, I hope that some of this discussion can help with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it really might mean that, you know, as a community, you talk about this a little more and see if people are willing to talk about it. Maybe they don't want to identify, but maybe sending something in anonymously or not. Mm-hmm. But I think really, for me, when you see Crip Camp and read the book, one thing that's always been important for me is to be able to have some of my friends have disabilities. who I would be able to go and speak with. And I think in many ways, you know, as Jews, we don't need to be in a community always with other Jews. But there are some times, you know, for me, and I'm sure for many of you, when there are things going on that you really want to discuss with other Jewish people, maybe even before you talk about them with other people. And that's what I think, you know, with the group that you're working with, I'm presuming, you know, that it really is intended to become a closer knit group of people that can be working on many things and looking at how disability is impacting you and or your families. And as I said, really looking at becoming invested in the future, which does include you, what you need to learn as individuals and as communities, I think is really important.
Absolutely. And I think it's clear that we have our homework cut out for us, but definitely broadening the tent and making everyone feel comfortable is a key aspect of the NEXTGen Detroit mission, and something that we take very seriously. So I take your words to heart, and excited for the kind of the next stage of what can come out of your insight here.
I just want to say one thing.
Please.
It says that there are 18 participants,
Mhm.
and in the chat box, there are no questions. That's not possible. I don't know who you are, so you can put anything down you want, but somebody should ask a question or make a comment.
And while they're doing that, Judy, because I want to make sure that I can ask you, so you know, you're speaking to a primarily Jewish audience. I was hoping you could elaborate on how your Jewishness has impacted your activism. And I know you mentioned earlier in the talk, you know, your parents losing family in the Holocaust, and how that impacted the way you were raised. I note from the book that you mention celebrating Shabbat and Passover during the 504 protests, which I thought was fascinating. So I guess I'm just curious if you could elaborate on, yeah, how your Jewishness has impacted your activism through your life.
So, you know, I think being Jewish is something that I've never looked at shying away from, in spite of the fact that, you know, the experience of the check, but another experience when I was denied the right to go to public school, and this is in the book, that my parents decided they'd try to get me into a Jewish day school. And so they went and spoke to this particular school, and I was going into the first grade, and the principal said I didn't know enough Hebrew. So my mother had me tutored by a Sabra many, many days during the summer, and then called the principal up and said that I could now enter the first grade. And the guy never intended to let me in. He just never thought that my mother would do this. So, you know, there have been lots of experiences where directly and indirectly, there wasn't any welcoming opportunity for me really to participate. But on the other hand, I always felt that being Jewish is a very intrinsic part of me. And I think it's also being from Brooklyn. And, you know, my parents they were learning as they were doing, you know, that they had to really become advocates for me in a way they didn't have to with my brothers. And so I think I was learning through them and through like my friends who had disabilities and their parents and my parents and their parents, you know, talking together about what to do. I was the first kid in my special ed classes to go to high school, because at that time, if you used a wheelchair, you went back onto home instruction. So education obviously was very important in the Jewish community. It was very important for my family. So I think it's really an interesting question because I live now near a synagogue that used to be open. And I was able to go by myself to services where when I was growing up, that wasn't true. So I was really exercising a choice about going to synagogue. And, you know, issues within various congregations about how they accept me and other people is something that, kind of always know is there. But I guess I just decided that I would continue to participate for myself and also with my friends. And so I maybe it's not a very quick answer to your question, but I think, being a Jew trumped out of, excuse me for saying that word, um, it really was too important for me to give up. I did in the end, however, not marry someone who was Jewish. I mean, I love my husband very much, but, marrying somebody who was Jewish just was not in the cards. And so I think, the community, because of work, I think that the Reutemann Foundation and others have been doing, and more disabled Jewish people who really have been speaking out, and the Jewish Federation, doing some more work in this area to really work on inclusion. But at the end of the day, there is still so much more that needs to be done. And I do think, that it's really important for groups like yours to really speak to disabled people who are Jewish, and really ask people, what is their experience? What is it that needs to be done in order, and again, not just young people, but older people. And I think many of the older people are not going to identify as having a disability, and they don't have to. But I think we need to make sure, for example, that we have prayer books in large print, that we have things like captioning, things that, people can just use, that's just there. You go onto iPhone or onto Microsoft now, and you've got accessibility features. Those accessibility features were not put in there by, the goodness of somebody's heart. It was laws and pressures that made these companies do these things, but it's opened the customer base quite significantly.
Mm.
Thank you so much. February, the national, I'm not a big one on months, but February is the National Jewish Disability Awareness Month. And yeah, so if you didn't know about that, many synagogues are doing something during those months, bringing speakers in to talk about issues. Many synagogues also have set up task forces or committees that are looking at issues around accessibility and inclusion. And so you can see, I think, some important changes that are being made. But, as a Jew, I'd like it to be much more. I'd like it to be where we're playing, more of a leadership role in this area.
Got you. And then heeding your call, we've got a number of questions in the chat here, but unfortunately we're running up against time here. So I'm going to try my best to kind of combine what if the number of the questions here are kind of getting at. So I'm going to ask, was that? You can see them.
The question. So
yeah.
One of them is, what are the key organizing tactics that work best? I was best for disability rights awareness. Read books, talk to people. I think those are two of the most important things to do. Get to know your neighbor, but really look at materials in disability studies. If you're on college campuses, or you're not maybe now, but if you're going to school as an undergraduate, graduate, or graduate, look at books that discuss issues around ableism and discrimination. I think, informing yourself as much as possible. There are many different organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN. You can go on their website. They've got great materials up there. The National Council on Independent Living is another great organization. National Association of the Deaf, National Federation of the Blind, many, many different groups where you can be reading about what is happening. I would say that would be one thing. And also, in whatever area that you're studying or working, and really begin to ask the question, where are other employees with disabilities? How are we serving this population of disabled people? Or are we serving disabled people? And are we doing a decent job? So I would say, look in the stratosphere that you're operating in. What are my hopes for the disability rights movement in the future? My hopes are that the movement continues to grow, that we become truly a more diverse movement. And by that, I mean diversity racially, but I also mean diversity as far as disability is concerned. Because I think it's very fair to say that, one of the big issues that we all need to address is that the more you look different, the more you sound different, the more you think differently, the more it is that you're likely not to be really a part of what's going on within the community, because other people don't necessarily treat one appropriately and are not opening and welcoming. So I think what we're really looking at, which is not going to happen overnight, is really consciously, when we look at issues of race, look at issues of race and disability. When we look at issues of the LGBTQ community, look at what's happening to disabled people from those communities, on and on. So I'm hoping for greater empowerment. I'm also hoping for better representation in the media, because I think there is such an absence of appropriate representation of disabled people in large and small ways, and are not being really a part of the media, meaning children's books don't have good representation. Films that are being made are not including disabled people in major or minor roles. Disabled people being played by non-disabled individuals. The media, the newspapers, and others not really understanding the issues and doing them appropriately. And looking at the number of times that disabled people are depicted as villains, or that disabled people are committing suicide because their lives, on screen are being portrayed as not being worthy. I think those are all very important issues. I mean, I'm looking at the last question about creating spaces for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I think, sit down, talk to people. There are self-advocacy groups all over the place, and invite people to come in and recognize that we need to listen, we need to be respectful. And I think as we become friends with people who may process information differently than we do, we still recognize that people have very valuable contributions to make. And I think that's really, what's important, is that we recognize people's interest in contributing to the community and to the whole.
Thank you so much, Judy. It's really been an honor chatting with you. I could literally talk to you all night. I have so many more questions, but unfortunately it's time to wrap up. So I'm going to pass it back to Andrew to do just that.
I think we all could talk all night. Judy, thank you so much. I have personally benefited from 504 planning in high school and college due to certain learning disabilities I have. And so I am extremely grateful on a personal level as well. Thank you again for speaking with us tonight. Thank you.
Do people in your group know you have learning disabilities?
Yes, actually. I've been a huge advocate for it. And actually, my brother has some learning disabilities as well. So I'm a huge advocate. I am one to absolutely spread awareness. And I have never been shy about 504 or any special accommodations I've received.
Great.
So I'm proud of it, if anything. I know that you and many others have come a long way to achieve it, and I'm lucky to have it. So I appreciate it. So thank you to Judy, and thank you all for attending this important event. If you guys are interested in purchasing Judy's memoir, you'll receive an email following this event about how to order it from the Pages Bookshop in Detroit. And I would highly suggest watching Crip Camp if you guys have not already. Thank you all again.
I could also say one other thing. So for those of you who do your reading on a audio, You can get my book in an audio version. It's read by a woman named Ali Stroker. Ali is a disabled woman, the first wheelchair user to perform on Broadway and to get a Tony Award for Best Performing Actress in a Revived Musical, Oklahoma. So, and you can get it on Kindle also. But if you buy the book, that'd be great in the hard copy if you can do that. And great that you'll go to a local store. Thank you all very much. And maybe you can do something in February.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, again, and have a great night. Judy, thank you again.
Bye, Ashley. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, Abby.
Judy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judy. Thank you again.
Bye.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you all for attending.